Nos acompañen ocupando sus lugares si son tan amables. Vamos a iniciar el día de hoy haciendo un ejercicio para retomar la dinámica con respecto a esta tecnología que tienen ustedes en su silla. Tienen un pequeño control de color blanco con un listón verde, cada quien en su silla tiene uno, y vamos a hacer este ejercicio para reactivar el sistema de votación electrónica. Así que por favor les vamos a pedir que tomen sus lugares, que ubiquen su control y que en un momentito más tengamos la oportunidad de hacer este ejercicio poniendo atención a las pantallas y a la pregunta que será lanzada en un momento más. Así que bienvenidas, bienvenidos una vez más. Sean tan amables de ocupar sus lugares. Estamos por retomar en pleno los trabajos de CAM 24 en esta segunda jornada de esta edición 24ª de la Convención de Aseguradores de México. Muchas gracias por su atención. Sírvanse a ocupar sus lugares, ubicar su control, su mando a distancia para el sistema de votación, un listón verde con una cajita color blanco con botones grises. Es lo único que necesitan para la siguiente votación. Ahí está ilustrado en las pantallas, así que en un momento más vamos a poner en las pantallas también la primera pregunta para hacer este ejercicio. Ahí la tienen. Para el próximo año, ¿qué tema les gustaría que abordaran los conferencistas magistrales? Ok, tienen toda la oportunidad ahora de manifestarlo, así que ahí está. Son 4 opciones. 1, motivacional. 2, económico-político. 3, futuro e innovación. Y 4, tendencias en seguros. Son 4 opciones. Una de 4 opciones ustedes han de pulsar en su control para saber ¿qué tema les gustaría que abordaran los conferencistas magistrales el próximo año? Adelante, tenemos algunos instantes para la votación, así que por favor, alguna de las 4 opciones. Ahí están los resultados. Muy bien. Muy metidos en el tema. Muchas gracias por participar. Opción número 1, 8%, es decir, no queremos conferencistas motivacionales. La 2, con 14%, tampoco queremos hablar demasiado de cuestiones económicas y políticas, aunque es año electoral el próximo. Futuro e innovación fue el segundo lugar, con 31%, y como lo ven, con 47% queremos especializarnos en nuestro tema. Así que probablemente el año próximo, tendencias en seguros será parte fundamental de las temáticas de nuestros conferencistas. Muy bien, vamos a ver la siguiente pregunta, así que muy listos con sus controles. ¿Usted tiene su casa y sus contenidos asegurados? A ver, es de suponerse que sí, pero vamos a verlo. ¿Usted tiene su casa y sus contenidos asegurados? Opción 1, sí. Opción 2, no. Y en la 3, alguna vez los tuve. Así que vamos a dar unos instantes para sus respuestas. Y bien, ahí están las respuestas, por supuesto que sí. 66%, una gran mayoría, tiene su casa y los contenidos de esta asegurados. Aunque un 25% dice que no. Bueno, y alguna vez lo tuvo un 9%. Muchas gracias por su participación. Esto obviamente es una herramienta que vamos a estar utilizando en diferentes momentos, así que ahora que ya lo conocen, gracias por participar. Muy bien, vamos a comenzar los trabajos de esta segunda jornada y lo vamos a hacer con nuestra primera conferencia. Lo que podemos decir de nuestro conferencista, que a continuación presentaremos, es que fue nombrado presidente de Lloyd en octubre de 2011. Anteriormente fue presidente de Hammerson plc hasta 2013. Trabajó en Kleinworth Benson para Reino Unido y Estados Unidos. En 1986 se unió a Lazard, convirtiéndose en vicepresidente en 1990. Fue presidente de Credit Suisse First Boston en Europa y vicepresidente de Kingfisher plc. Además ha trabajado en BT, Woolwich plc, JP Morgan, Cazenove Group. Es asesor superior en Charterhouse Capital Partners LLP. También ha sido presidente de Chichester Harbour Trust y miembro del Consejo de la Galería Nacional, en donde preside el Comité de Desarrollo. Señoras y señores, demos la bienvenida y un fuerte aplauso al señor John Nelson, presidente de Lloyd. Y para conocer un poco de la historia de Lloyd, por favor, en cabina pedimos, corre video.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and can I first of all apologize for my Spanish. And I want to thank my colleague for that very kind introduction. It is indeed a great honor here to be invited to open today by AMIS, and I hope that today will be a really interesting day for all of us. It is not often that I have the chance to address an audience of around 1,000 people, but by very good fortune, I had an opportunity to practice on a very large audience only 6 weeks ago, which was when Lloyds were greatly honoured to receive a visit from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and the Duke of Edinburgh. On that occasion, I spoke in the famous underwriting room of Lloyds to almost 10,000 people. It was a great warm-up event for today. Indeed, when the Queen came, I spoke about how Lloyds has evolved over its 325 years. First, we were a marine insurer, protecting cargoes, leaving London for all parts of the globe. And then just over 100 years ago, we moved into insuring the new technologies of the 20th and 21st centuries, insuring the first motor cars and aircraft, and later, of course, the first space vehicles and satellites. But the central point I made 6 weeks ago to the underwriters and the brokers, as well as to the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, was that Lloyd's next chapter is to develop enduring partnerships with the higher growth countries. Mexico is a wonderful example of this. And today, I want to confirm that Lloyd's has plans within the next 12 months, subject to regulatory approvals, to open our office in Mexico City. Now, why are we doing this? The Mexican economy is extraordinarily dynamic, and the reform agenda currently being undertaken by the government is a huge testament to the boldness with which Mexico is addressing the future. But the growth and opportunity which has characterized the last decade of Mexico's history is, of course, threatened by your vulnerability to natural catastrophes. So the theme of today's conference, natural and man-made catastrophes, is indeed well chosen. Our job, our contribution to Mexico's economic success is to identify how this country can use insurance and risk management to protect itself from the sudden shocks that follow catastrophic events. Mexico faces storms and floods, not only on your Atlantic coast, but also on your Pacific coast. It is also vulnerable to earthquakes, particularly in this city, over 20 million people, GDP $400 billion. I can think of few places on earth where the role of insurance to protect the economy, businesses, and communities from the financial impact of catastrophe is so marked. Lloyd's, of course, understands these risks well. We were amongst the largest insurer of events such as 9/11 and hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma, and also more recent events such as Superstorm Sandy, which hit the east coast of the United States in 2012, the 2011 floods in Thailand and Australia, and of course the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, which caused such devastating impacts on Japan. More recently, we have covered the terrible tragedies of the missing Malaysian airliner and the South Korean ferry. I want to discuss these issues of catastrophic loss and how Mexico can use insurance to cover these events during this session. But first, I would like to say a few words about the issues currently facing the global insurance industry. We at Lloyd's have just posted some outstanding financial results for 2013. Profits of $5.3 billion, a combined ratio of just under 87%, and a return on capital of 16%. But of course, part of this was due to the fact that there were very few major cats in the world in 2013, although it may not feel like that for all of you sitting in this room, as hurricanes Ingrid and tropical storm Manuel concurrently caused damage of almost $6 billion, the bulk of which impacted public infrastructure. I've never been quite sure who names hurricanes, but in this case, Ingrid and Manuel were well chosen, as our manager in Mexico, Gabriel Aguano, was pointed out to me this morning. We only have to look at the chairman and the chief executive of Patria Re. But more seriously, Ingrid and Manuel showed the absolute devastation which storms cause, particularly when they arrive in quick succession. In this case, these two storms killed 192 and seriously tested the emergency services. It's important we learn from these events. At the Lloyds, one of the ways we do this is through a comprehensive set of realistic disaster scenarios, RDSs. So, for example, after Katrina, Rita, and Wilma, the latter of which caused such loss in Cancun, we examined how we could manage better events happening in quick succession to each other. In fact, a few years ago, someone looked through our list of RDSs and asked why we had one for the northeastern seaboard of the United States, telling me that storms don't cause much damage that far north. Unfortunately, of course, that question was comprehensively answered in October when Sandy hit New York and its surrounding areas. It was, in fact, a good example of a robust RDS, where the degree of devastation was accurately modelled and was accurately forecast. But I think the catastrophe where we learned the most was unsurprisingly the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001. In this case, a catastrophe provoked by humans rather than by the forces of nature. 9/11, in so many ways, broke every insurance record. At times like this, the focus is quite rightly on the human loss. Our job is secondary, trying to mitigate the financial loss, but we must still learn from each event. In our 325 years, we've gone through some tough times. The San Francisco earthquake in 1906, Hurricane Andrew in the Gulf of Mexico, the loss of the Piper Alpha rig in the North Sea, and the loss of the Exxon Valdez. We learned something from each of these about safety measures, about how to write policies which incentivize risk-reducing behavior. However, 9/11 changed the industry, and it completely transformed Lloyd's. We revolutionized our supervision, putting in place a system which scrutinized the business plans of every syndicate writing in the London market with one aim: to ensure that we would be able to meet all future claims and to continue to trade through these disasters and afterwards. We met all of our claims for 9/11, but we were in a bit of a crisis state. The best way to illustrate how Lloyd's has invested in a safety-first culture since 2001 is, in fact, to compare 9/11 with the coincidence of catastrophes which beset the world in 2011. So in 2011, the total claims from the Japanese tsunami, the New Zealand earthquake, and the floods in Australia and in Thailand led to a very similar result to that which we experienced after 9/11 in terms of the contribution of large claims to the combined ratio. But there was an absolutely critical difference. In 2001, we burnt through 70% of our capital. In 2011, it was just 3%. We don't, though, run a zero failure regime. That's impossible in an industry as volatile as ours. And this is particularly the case for Lloyd's, which specializes in high risk and difficult cover. But we do have good, firm prudential regulation, which is good for the insured and the insurer alike. Our clients need continuity, and they need to trust us to pay claims. And our capital providers need to be confident that we can be profitable over time. This focus on underwriting profitability also means that we are withstanding the current market conditions: low interest rates, volatility in the Eurozone, and excess capital, all of which are testing the insurance industry. Although growth rates in both the developed and emerging economies are at lower levels than they've been in recent years, there are some grounds for optimism. Confidence appears to be picking up in the United States, which should have a positive impact here in Mexico. Leading indicators in the United Kingdom are improving, Even in the Eurozone, we are seeing no further deterioration, and there is some flickering optimism in some Eurozone countries. In Asia, of course, conditions have remained relatively strong, even with China operating at lower growth rates than in recent history. But during these difficult conditions, the insurance industry has emerged over the last few years with an excellent performance, a testament to the robustness of our insurance model. This compares very well with the performance of the banking sector, another industry which I know well and spent 30 years of my career in. Insurance has been seen as the less glamorous side of the financial services industry. That may be so, but we've shown great dependability over the last few difficult years, mainly because of the robustness of our business model. In essence, a total focus on measuring and pricing risk appropriately. One of the impacts of this very low growth, of course, is quantitative easing, and it's drastically reduced investment returns for our industry. For us at Lloyd's, our investment returns fell to just 1.6% last year. We have to assume that these exceptionally low interest rates in our main markets will remain at least for the time being. We live in a low interest rate environment, and that is what is driving excess capital and alternative capital into the industry. I am concerned about the risks that some of this capital may present. We need to guard against cheap capital being deployed with more emphasis on short-term return than long-term stability and sustainability. The interest of the customer is quite clear, and that is that risk transfer facilities have to be produced year in, year out, without excessively volatile premium rates. So the structure in which this capital is deployed is so important. We at Lloyd's are looking closely at how to harness these new forms of capital from pension funds and hedge funds, for example, and we are deploying them in the market, but we are doing this carefully. Most of the alternative capital at the moment is being driven into peak risk. Some of it is here in Mexico, and it is most often used in more packaged products involving a basis risk with a parametric trigger. To put this in plain English, it means that claims will only be paid when a certain industry threshold is reached or a certain natural event meets precise parameters. To use a recent example, many reinsurance cat bonds for US windstorm set a $20 billion industry loss as the point when claims would be paid out. This has advantages for the capital provider and the reinsurer, as they're able to understand and manage potential losses. However, is it as good for the customer? It certainly wasn't for those who were affected by Sandy, as the industry loss was assessed at $18.7 billion, so claims weren't paid. A similar situation occurred in April 2010, when an earthquake devastated Baja California, but its epicenter was outside the zone defined in the cat bond parameters. And when a hurricane struck the state of Tamaulipas 2 months later, it was less powerful than the threshold, and Mexico received no money. Of course, parametric products can help in providing cover in areas with little tradition of insurance and where there is a shortage of indemnity-based solutions. If there is no infrastructure of claims adjusters and an insurer is looking to pay many low-value claims, a parametric product may be the answer. And I don't discount the value of this in bringing cover to many people who've not been able to transfer their risk in the past. However, for our customers at Lloyd's, the businesses on the Dow Jones, the FTSE 100, the Fortune 500, the Euro 30, I question if parametric products are sophisticated enough. So we're going to primarily look at how to divert some of this capital into indemnity-based products. This means that the insured has a policy tailored for him, covering all the losses you might experience, and if the worst happens, we pay out funds to cover the actual loss. Although the excess of capital is depressing premium prices at the moment, I do believe that in the long term, these capital resources are a huge opportunity for the industry because global insurance penetration remains dangerously low. And this is, I believe, one of the biggest challenges facing the global industry: how to provide the specialist insurance requirements which faster growing economies will need as they're commercializing and industrializing. The world economy has changed. Countries such as Mexico now have global power, but in many cases are severely underinsured. Here in Mexico, insurance penetration stands at just 2.1% of GDP. But it's encouraging to see that premium growth is beginning to increase penetration. The average penetration rates, by contrast, in Europe are around 7%, with the UK on 11.3%. And these countries are, of course, much less exposed than Mexico to natural disasters. In the United States, which is prone to natural disaster, penetration levels are over 8%. We published at Lloyd's a report in October 2012 which examined the level of underinsurance, specifically in relation to natural catastrophes. We found that 17 countries, some of which are very large indeed, are identified as severely underinsured, with a total coverage gap of around 170 billion US dollars in terms of a shortfall in annual premium volume. In terms of this country, we believe that Mexican business needs to spend an additional $7.8 billion in premium annually just to reach the minimum standards of cover. This puts Mexico in the severely underinsured category. On the global league table, you sit one place below Brazil. But you may be interested to know that China is 3 places below Mexico. But in terms of premium shortfall, it is, of course, the most underinsured in the world, with a shortfall of $80 billion in premium on the same annual basis. So why are Mexico's insurance penetration rates so low? Is it because lots of businesses here retain risk through self-insurance programs and the use of captives? Is it because there isn't a culture of insurance or understanding how risk transfer can help business manage the financial impact of sudden shocks? Or is it because the industry are failing to provide the right products for Mexican business? In many high-growth countries, governments have not paid sufficient attention to insurance. But I don't now believe this to be the case in Mexico. My experience of the Mexican government is that it has a serious approach to ensuring its assets adequately. Mexico is Lloyd's of London's largest market in Latin America, despite not being the largest economy or indeed the largest insurance market in the regions. And one of the reasons for this is because the government sees the value in international reinsurers supporting the Mexican industry. This is an intelligent approach. Mexico cedes $3.7 billion of premium to the international industry each year, of which 39% is catastrophe-related. So the government is clearly looking at how to ensure that the economic impact of catastrophe is spread across international reinsurers, not concentrated here. Another country which does this very well is New Zealand. over half of New Zealand's $30 billion of economic losses in 2011, following those two terrible earthquakes in Christchurch, were picked up by international insurers, which has considerably reduced the economic impact on the country. It's abundantly clear why raising penetration levels is so important. Mexico faces a wide variety of hazards: earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, hurricanes, wildfires, floods, landslides, droughts, and even frost, something I was rather surprised to learn, as I always think about the wonderful temperature in Mexico City. Between 1970 and 2009, approximately 60 million people were affected by natural disasters in Mexico. The country is ranked as one of the world's 30 most exposed countries to 3 or more types of natural hazard. And I think that it is this which is driving a sensible approach by the federal and state governments to diversifying risk. And of course, the advantage of diversifying risk internationally is not just financial. It means that one is able to involve reinsurers that have an expert knowledge of dealing with catastrophic events around the world. We are always keen to share that experience with our local carriers after a catastrophe. For example, following the Chilean earthquake of 2010, we sent a team of claim experts to the country to assist our clients there. There's a long way for us to go before we say that insurance is doing what it's designed for, to allow communities to rebuild following disaster. That means building up penetration rates in underinsured countries and also coming up with innovative products. As business evolves and uses new technologies, we in insurance need to create new products and processes to serve them. Now, so far, I've looked at how the industry has dealt with catastrophic loss in the past, but I want to look forward and discuss what I believe could be the long-term challenge and the biggest long-term challenge facing our industry, and that is, of course, climate change. Tomorrow, Lloyd's publishes a report which calls for the insurance industry to address the impact of climate change on modelling and reinforces our long-standing message that this will have an impact on your bottom line. I know that we have Vice President Al Gore speaking at this conference later today, and I have no doubt he will make a far more persuasive case than I for the steps which the international community must take to address this issue. But let me say this: none of us should be in any doubt that climate change is happening and that sea levels are rising. I have a personal interest in this issue, as I live close to Chichester in the United Kingdom, which has one of the largest natural harbours in the UK. It is an area of outstanding natural beauty, with wetlands renowned for birds and wildlife. But the local community is now beginning to manage a retreat of the flood defences to account for the rising sea levels. So this is an issue quite literally on my back door at home, but also very much on my radar at work. Insurers are less interested in whether climate change can be attributed to individual events, and more in whether extreme events are becoming more frequent. I think we know that they are. 13 of the 14 warmest years on record have all occurred in this 21st century. Each of the last 3 decades has been warmer than the previous one. The cost of global disasters has risen from an annual average of about $50 billion in the 1980s to close to $200 billion over the last decade. Of course, there are many reasons for this: demographic change and the change in value of assets, but climate is a significant factor. Our report sets out that the 20 centimetres of sea level rise at the southern tip of Manhattan Island in New York increased Sandy's surge losses by 30%. The cost of catastrophes in Mexico is going up too. Between 1980 and 1999, the average yearly cost of catastrophes, like cyclones, floods, and droughts, was $55 million, and that's grown to over $1.6 billion between 2000 and 2012. Mexico's geographic location means that over the next few decades, temperature increases here will surpass global increases. Higher temperatures won't just increase the frequency of catastrophic events, they will have an impact on agricultural yields, the spread of disease, and the survival of livestock. According to the IPCC, coffee production in Veracruz is projected to decline 34% by 2020 if historic temperature and precipitation trends continue, affecting hundreds of thousands of households. The Mexican Climate Modeling Network has done some very interesting work looking at the vulnerability of Mexico's strategic assets. They found that a substantial number of Mexico's energy installations are located in areas where there is a high risk of flooding. A quarter of Mexico's population and more than 7 million homes are at risk of floods and landslides. And this affects all of us in insurance. At Lloyd's, virtually every class of business we write will be affected by the potential increase in catastrophic events caused by climate change. There are the obvious business areas that are affected, like property catastrophe, crop insurance. But Superstorm Sandy was responsible for claims for up to $500 million for fine art, which is less surprising when you consider that beachfront homes command large real estate prices. Lloyd's reinsures a large proportion of Mexico's artifacts and cultural heritage, so we're very conscious of the impact of flooding on some risk areas which might not be quite top of mind. After seeing your government's action plan for dealing with climate change, I know we share concerns around modelling and the incorporation of climate change into CAT models. Insurers need to consider how the tools they use, and of course I'm expressly thinking about models here, adequately measure and price risks, including the influence of climate change. And I think we can work together as an industry to mitigate the impact of climate change through adaptation. This means, for example, to be very specific, using water membrane bricks, building houses on stilts to reduce the effect of floods. If you want to know more about this, we did publish a report which is still available in 2008 on coastal defences. And I would also commend ClimateWise, an organisation set up to work with insurers on climate issues. Insurers have a close relationship with the building industry. I personally have strong links with this industry, having been chairman of a major European retail property business, Hammerson, for many years. I think we can be proud at what this partnership has achieved in reducing the risks from earthquakes by encouraging the use of building codes in policy documents, which have encouraged adaptation to risk. Can we do the same for flooding now? I very much hope that the industry can use the tools which it has at its disposal, from premium rates charged to policy wordings, to make the world a little more resilient to climate change. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know that these are big issues, but one of the features of society today is that we should not leave all of these questions for governments. Business has a significant role. We have a role to combat underinsurance and protect economies from the impact of disaster. And we can also use instruments like CAT models and policy documents to reduce risk and to encourage risk reduction. Mexico is clearly determined to make progress in covering these issues. I think we can help. Mexico is not a new market for Lloyd's. We've been covering risks here for over 100 years. but I would like to see us develop Lloyd's long-established relationship with Mexico further. One of our strategies is to look at how we can diversify by attracting high-quality carriers, capital and people into the Lloyd's market. Mexico, which is a well-placed and talented insurance market, offers potentially extremely interesting opportunities in this respect. We always welcome new lines of high-quality business into Lloyd's. If you take one message from this speech today, is that we want to open Lloyd's, the world's largest, best-known, and only specialist insurance market, up to all of you, the Mexican industry. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions, and I wish you a very successful conference for the rest of today. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos al presidente de Lloyd's, al señor John Nelson, y también agradecemos que se sirva a ocupar su lugar al frente al licenciado Manuel Escobedo, presidente de Reaseguradora Patria, quien estará a cargo de las preguntas del público. Así que mucha atención, viene la sesión de preguntas y respuestas.
Mr. Nelson, hello again. It is my honor to welcome you to this beautiful city of Mexico, and I think my colleagues have done it in the past. I thank you personally for a very interesting speech. I was particularly interested by the confirmation that Lloyd's will be opening a representation in Mexico. I think that is grand news, grand news. And as your assigned hangman today, if you may, I have a number of questions here that your words and message has prompted among the convention. So let me see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plenty of questions. Right. How big of a concern are long-term interest rates at Lloyd's? Are there correlations between interest rates and your insurance risks?
Yes. Low interest rates, it's an obvious financial modeling exercise, mean that the returns coming into the general insurance industry are lower, and therefore into the insurance carriers and the Lloyd's market, and therefore we have to improve our underwriting discipline. And I think that is something which the industry and Lloyd's have demonstrated in the last few years. The reason that, but we get into a kind of a circular argument, that as the returns on capital have remained relatively robust, in Lloyd's case, our average return on capital has been about 14.8% over the last 10 years. Last year was 16%. We will continue to attract capital in. My biggest nervousness about this capital is that there are signs that some of the capital, rather as happened in the banking industry, is becoming semi-detached from the underlying risk transfer. And I think it's very, very important that we keep the capital nailed to the underlying transaction. And that actually is why I believe that the industry has been successful despite the financial shocks thrown at it over the last sort of 7 or 8 years. We expect to see a continuation of low interest rates. We expect to see a continuation of more capital wanting to come into the industry. Is something that the industry and Lloyd's has to adapt to. On the other hand, the growth that we're seeing, or we can foresee in the industry worldwide over the next 10 or 15 years, if I give you 2 numbers, we think in Lloyd's our addressable market at the moment is about $600 billion a year. We think that's going to rise to north of $2 trillion in 15 years' time. So we are going to need a lot more capital. Part of the problem is the capital's arrived a bit early.
Right. Could you talk about a little bit more about the details of Lloyd's office in Mexico? Is it your plan to have underwriters here or just administrative services? When do you think to start the operation?
We are planning to open the office subject to obtaining the necessary regulatory approvals within the next 12 months. So I would say it would be either side of the end of 2014. The office will be, to start with, a small representative office. In terms of the managing agents coming to Mexico, of whom, of course, there are people in this room will have a large number of relationships. We already have a significant business in Mexico. I said it's our single largest market in Latin America. It's really here. We're opening the office, a small office to start with, really to help us to keep the access lines and communications open and improve that with the Mexican insurance industry. I don't anticipate us having a very large office to start with.
Right. Can you tell us more about what Lloyd's is doing to ensure climate change is taken into account for its planning processes, for example, in its models?
Yes. I referred to it in my speech, that the regulatory environment or supervisory environment that we have at Lloyd's over our syndicates and managing agents, which is basically the approval of annual business plans, and on the back of that, capital setting year by year, and those business plans are monitored. We want to see in the business plans and in the modeling specific account taken of climate change trends. And as I said to you, it is, in my remarks, it is quite extraordinary how climate change seems to affect every single line of business that we do. And we look at that, and we look at that both quantitatively but also qualitatively in terms of setting capital. So if we judge that a good assessment has been made of climate change, the capital requirements will be somewhat lower than they otherwise might be. The other thing that we're doing with climate change is encouraging a great deal more effort within the modelling community to look ahead as well as looking back at data. There's now enough trend data to begin to model what might happen in the future. So we've got organizations which some of you will have heard of, like Oasis and so on, who are very heavily involved in this, which are supported by the insurance industry. And I think that all of those modeling firms are looking very hard at this, and we keep a close eye on it.
Do we trust them?
Do we trust them? There's also no substitute for judgment.
Which is your growth expectation of Mexico's insurance industry? How will Lloyd's contribute to achieve this growth?
Well, I would expect that and hope that the Mexican growth in insurance, because of the low penetration rates, should definitely be exceeding GDP growth. I think if that wasn't the case, obviously we wouldn't be increasing penetration. And on the numbers that we have, we can see that that is happening. So insurance penetration rates are increasing. How rapidly that will happen, I think, is down to a lot of us in this room and a lot of other people. But I think it's getting across the message of the importance of insurance to risk management by major business enterprises, by government, by SMEs, and so on. And I think that I see Lloyd's playing a role in that in the sectors in which we specialize. So specialist B2B, catastrophe risk, and I think by being here, hopefully we will help that process. We
have been, after all, the land of tomorrow for many years, haven't we?
A well-managed land of tomorrow.
There you go. If the terrorist attack of 9/11 had similar impact on combined ratios as events of 2011, why was the loss of capital so different?
It was really for a number of reasons. Perhaps the first was that if I roll the camera back to 2001, the quality of the RDSs and the predictions were not as good as they are today. The quality of the underwriting was not as good. So if you like, the attritional losses were higher relatively in 2001 than in 2011. So we had plenty of profit to support the loss that occurred in 2011. And I think also that if you look at just the general prudence and conservatism in terms of reserving, it is of a far higher standard today than it was then. So that is why it was actually 2011, I always describe it as a really good stress test for Lloyd's and indeed for the whole insurance industry, that coincidence of catastrophes actually led to surprisingly little blood on the floor in the industry. And that I think was a testament to the whole industry.
Right. The aggregate values in the world, despite the economic cycles, keep on increasing. Do you foresee in the near future a shortage of cat cover?
Well, that is exactly the point I was making earlier on. I think we are going to come to the point, and climate change is going to be a significant factor in this, where we are going to need more and more capital. At the moment, everybody in this room, I'm sure, would agree we almost have too much capital. And there are some serious worries about how some of that capital is trying to enter the industry. And as I said, I think it's very important to keep the capital nailed to the risk transfer. But I would say that for the foreseeable future, there is sufficient capital available to cover as I say, the foreseeable future, but it may not last forever. For example, if interest rates rose, investment returns outside the industry improved, the volume of capital would begin to reduce proportionately, so of new capital. So that there could be, yes, a tightening up, but I don't see that in the short term.
Right. And unless somebody else comes up with something else, the last question of the day: how does climate-wise, which you mentioned in your speech, help the industry respond to the challenge of global warming?
Well, Climate-wise is an excellent organization which has been put together by really a consortium, it's a non-profit-making consortium of insurance companies to study a whole range of issues on climate change. They do, I think, a very good job. We focus on them, we have very close connections with them, and I would encourage anybody who's interested, they're on all sorts of websites and so on, to have a look.
Perfect. Well, Mr. Nelson, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your speech, your comments, all your questions. Thank you, everyone. And I understand... It is a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias al presidente de Lloyd, al señor John Nelson, y también al licenciado Manuel Escobedo, presidente de Reaseguradora Patria, quien moderó la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Muchas gracias a ambos. Señoras y señores, vamos a tener un breve receso, así que les invitamos a reingresar al salón en 15 minutos, si son tan amables. Tenemos 15 minutos de receso, así que, por favor, les recordamos que...